We actually went on a tour of Pripyat, the town itself, which was a pretty decent-sized town. And imagine, this is the Twilight Zone part, to have this big boulevard with all these apartment buildings on each side with huge vines growing through the windows. And it was like somebody turned the lights off and everybody left. It was this ghost town.
That's the voice of Gretchen Hund, former director of Pacific Northwest National Laboratory's Center for Global Security and current Ploughshares Fund board member. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back, and thanks for tuning into our 50th episode of Press the Button. We are now recording these episodes remotely. We're locked down because of the coronavirus pandemic. Both our San Francisco and DC offices remain closed. So I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm recording this from Washington, DC.
And I'm Michelle Dover, and I'm recording this from New Haven, Connecticut.
We are hoping to keep these podcasts going throughout these challenging times. We think it's a chance for you to listen to something that maybe will give you some insights into what's happening with the pandemic, but it also may be a chance for you to pull back a bit and reflect on some of the other pressing issues that are challenging us in the 21st century. And there's a lot going on and that we try to keep you up to date with our early warning segment. Michelle, what do you got for them today?
That's right. On today's early warning, we're focusing on the congressional negotiations that took place over the weekend about an economic stimulus package in response to the crisis. And we are also focusing on U.S.-Iran relations in light of the current pandemic. As you've seen, Iran has been particularly hard hit by COVID-19. After that, you'll hear Joe and I interview Gretchen Hund, a Ploughshares Fund board member who has some incredible perspectives on the nuclear issues.
Gretchen is the former director of the Center for Global Security at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. That's one of our nuclear laboratories. And she visited Chernobyl about a decade after that catastrophe. And she has some fascinating insights that are interesting in themselves about Chernobyl. If you saw that HBO series like I did, you're going to want to hear what she has to say. But it also offers some insights into how an unexpected catastrophe like this requires a whole of government response and the deadly consequences of lying to the public or slow walking your response.
That's right. And Gretchen also talks about the Hanford site in Eastern Washington, which was a part of the Manhattan Project. I actually grew up near Hanford, so this issue is near and dear to both my heart and my health. And after the interview, we have a little bit of extra fun with our question and answer today. We've got a great question from a listener in Vermont that, Joe, I think you're going to appreciate.
Okay, thanks. I can't wait. If you've been listening to Press the Button for a while, or if you're a first-time listener and you like what you hear, please share it with a friend. Next time you're on a Zoom meeting or a Facebook chat, tell a friend about us. Most of the country may be quarantined, but this is actually a great time for podcasts. Some of them help you get insights into the current crisis. Some of them help you get away from the current crisis. Whichever one Press the Button is for you, I hope you'll let a friend know about your favorite nuclear podcast next time you talk.
I really do hope we're your favorite. Please give us a rating, a review, or a share. Your feedback is a big help to us.
And we have a lot to share with you today, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Wendy Jordan, a senior policy analyst at Taxpayers for Common Sense, and Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares Fund. Ladies, we have 7 minutes to cover this week's national security and nuclear news, and our time starts now. Wendy, over the weekend, Congress failed to come to an agreement on a $2 trillion economic stimulus package that's intended to provide relief to Americans affected by the pandemic. As of this recording, it still has not passed, so we will see how this plays out. One of the main disagreements has been over how much direction the Treasury Department should be given in how the money is allocated towards business loans. What principles should Congress be using to guide how the money is spent?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. We appreciate the opportunity at Taxpayers for Common Sense to talk about this very important issue. Before we started diving into the various drafts of legislation, stimulus legislation, we sat back, took a deep breath, and wrote up our principles for coronavirus disaster response. And people, I'm going to hit the highlights for you right now, but if people want to read the whole thing, it's pretty detailed. They can go to taxpayer.net and look at it. But basically, our principles at TCS are you should do what's necessary, but not what's advantageous. The major reason for having a disaster response to coronavirus is to mitigate damage and to save lives. After that, you also want to build a bridge to better times, but it shouldn't be designed to make industries whole or families whole. That is not what a disaster response bill should do. Second, our second principle is, as a taxpayer organization, we're always thinking about deficits. Deficits still matter in the long run, and we don't want to amass huge further federal deficits. Our view is we have what we call the economic Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm to the economy. This is uncharted territory as far as what this virus is going to do to the U.S. economy. But we still need to be thinking about deficit. Our preference would be if the U.S. government would prioritize response on mechanisms with the greatest positive effects for Americans. So SNAP, WIC, unemployment insurance, SBA loans, they all exist already. They're programs that are up and running, and they have existing delivery systems and can provide immediate relief to people. Our fourth principle is emergency legislation should not make permanent changes or create long-term liabilities. We should not be in an emergency, hurried way, be making ill-considered long-term changes to statutes. And our fifth, and I cannot emphasize this enough, transparency and accountability are key in this. Oversight still matters. If I could get a hashtag oversight matters trending, we would be very happy at TCS. So we need to follow the money. The inspectors general, in several of these cases where more money is being spent, inspectors general are also getting bumps to their budgets, which is important because the IGs are going to have to be watching for fraud. So those are our basic principles.
Thanks for that. Mary, as of this moment, Iran has had over 23,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and almost 2,000 deaths. The New York Times reported this weekend that there are several senior advisors in the Trump administration, however, that want to escalate military action against Iran while it is under this intense crisis. So far, the Department of Defense has pushed back. Why would the administration be considering such drastic actions right now?
Well, this really was a shocking report by the New York Times. So as you say, Michelle, Iran is facing a severe humanitarian crisis. Coronavirus has impacted Iran in a very serious way. Thousands of deaths and more coming every day. So they're facing a humanitarian crisis. It's been exacerbated by the severe U.S. sanctions on Iran. Instead of viewing this as an opportunity to extend some humanitarian aid and possibly relieve Iran from some of those sanctions, there are some hardliners within the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Pompeo and the new Director of National Intelligence, Rick Grenell, who have been arguing that this is an opportunity because the Iranian regime is in a weakened position, that this is an opportunity to double down on the maximum pressure campaign And even reportedly, they've been arguing for increased military action against Iran, including perhaps direct attacks against Iranian naval vessels. That would, of course, be extremely dangerous, severely increase the risk of escalation into a full-scale conflict with Iran. And it's really shocking that Pompeo and others are arguing for this at a time when the U.S. should really be extending humanitarian aid rather than even considering military force.
Yeah, it was really striking to me because even though, the Iranian regime's response really has been negligent is an understatement. The impact of these sanctions has just been horrific right now. Has there actually been any effort by the U.S. to lift the sanctions to allow for humanitarian assistance?
Absolutely. So there have been increasing calls within the U.S. From some experts and policymakers and organizations, including Ploughshares. We just signed a letter coming from over 25 organizations calling for the U.S. to temporarily suspend some of the sanctions that the Trump administration has imposed on Iran. And again, these sanctions, as you've described, Michelle, they're really broad and very aggressive. Ostensibly, Trump imposed them to impact the behavior of the Iranian regime, but they've failed to do that. In fact, these sanctions are worsening the humanitarian crisis. They're causing increased suffering by the people of Iran. It's really a moral obligation and in U.S. national security interests to relieve those sanctions.
Thanks, Mary. And thanks to both you and Wendy for joining us. Today, Joe and I are joined by Gretchen Hund, former director of PNNL Center for Global Security, now a Ploughshares Fund board member, and a very dear friend. I am so excited that you could join us today.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here as well.
It's a pleasure to be with you here in San Francisco, and we want to talk with you about one of the unreported aspects of nuclear policy, the environmental impact of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. We were very interested to learn that you had actually been in Chernobyl, got a firsthand look at what a nuclear cleanup entails. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I should start by saying it wasn't super soon since the accident was in 86 and I was there in 99. But what's really cool, it was right after the United States government decided, wow, we need to be working with these people to try and make sure that the scientists who are still there don't end up going to Iran and North Korea. And so they opened up this laboratory that we went over as Americans to try to help train them.
This is part of the lab-to-lab work.
Exactly. So I was there for that work, and that's what brought me there.
Representing what laboratory?
So at the time, I was with Battelle, and Battelle is a nonprofit that runs several national laboratories, but I was working for Battelle itself. Uh-huh. Since then, I went over to work for Pacific Northwest National Lab, but at the time, I was actually with Battelle.
So what was it like?
It was actually kind of Twilight Zone-ish. And there was really kind of three pieces to it. The first is we went to this town called Slavutic. And for those of you who don't know what Slavutic is, it's a town that was literally built almost overnight. So think about this. You had this huge accident happen. All of these people are displaced. They're all told they're going to get to come back and actually see and collect their goods, but they never were able to ever come back to Pripyat, the town they lived in. So overnight, they had to build this town and move all these people there. So when I showed up, my job was to train them. It was to try to train these people who former workers, some had come in, and to try to help them see that there were jobs out there other than running a nuclear power plant that could actually keep them engaged, again, so that they didn't run off to North Korea or Iran or some other place. So that was the kind of scientist-to-scientist engagement. So there was that work. And then the second piece was we actually went on a tour of Pripyat, the town itself, which was a pretty decent-sized town. And imagine, this is the Twilight Zone part, to have this big boulevard with all these apartment buildings on each side with huge vines growing through the windows. And it was like somebody turned the lights off and everybody left. It was this ghost town. It was super eerie. And there are only certain parts of the town where we were allowed to walk around because of the contamination still and the radiation that many years later. But they knew, and we all had counters on us, Geiger counter, make sure that we were not being exposed. And from there, you could see the sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus is the building that was built over the unit that blew, which is Unit 4. And so then we went actually to Chernobyl itself and saw the sarcophagus, and we could only get so close. And what most people don't know is that there are 4 reactors at Chernobyl. Most people think of Chernobyl as this one thing that blew, and that was it.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so the reactor 4 is the one that blew, and then we have reactor 1 and 2 that both got shut down for various reasons. But what was left? Reactor 3. And it was still operating when I'm there. So that's why all the money was being spent by the international community to go there, was to try and talk the Ukrainians into shutting this reactor down. And imagine, there's literally a wall between the reactor 4 that blew and the reactor 3 that's still operating.
Wow.
And they needed those jobs, they needed that energy. And so we have to convince them that, no, this energy isn't that important. These jobs are not that important. We're going to find other things for you to do. And finally, in the year 2000, it was shut down.
So what was the impact of Chernobyl?
Well, there were several, but one I'd love to mention is the political. So it turns out that Gorbachev, as you well know, was in charge at that point. And because this was left in the dark for 9 days, that nobody knew what happened, when it finally did come out, and by the way, I got to meet the guy in Sweden who discovered this. He was at the Forsmark facility, and all this radiation is coming outside of the facility. He can't figure out where it's coming from. And he looks at the signature in the wind direction, figures out it's coming from Chernobyl, and blew the whistle internationally. And it was 9 full days of all of that horrible mess going on before the international community knew. And I think
or
that
anybody in the Soviet Union knew.
Exactly. And so I think that single-handedly, maybe not single-handedly, but it was an enormous factor in having the demise of him and what happened to the Soviet Union basically falling apart.
What do you mean? I mean, like, it undermined him domestically?
Yes, because the people all of a sudden saw, how can I trust this man? How can this have gone on for this many days and all of these people got killed, so the health impacts? How could have this gone on without me knowing? Do I trust the science and technology regime around this? No, hell no. So I think that there were political impacts, health impacts, environmental impacts. I mean, they all, and then economic. I mentioned that, these reactors that ended up getting taken offline and not having the power and all of that. So it was a mess, colossal mess.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that the man who was promoting glasnost
I know
gets toppled for covering up an environmental disaster.
Well, and frankly, I really think it was obviously the people underneath him. I mean, the poor man was really kept in the dark himself and didn't know.
But he takes the hit. Well, I've never been to Chernobyl, but I did see the HBO series.
Me too.
and in fact, we work closely with a group called Hollywood Health and Society, part of the Norman Lear Center at the University of Southern California. And I was one of the judges this year as they judge TV shows on their social impact and their contribution to educating the public while they're doing entertainment, educating them about these issues. And the winner in our category, national security, was the Chernobyl series. Did you see that?
Of course.
It was chilling.
Yes. No question.
And, what struck me was the enormous environmental damage that comes from this thing that, while it's operating normally, is safe. You can walk near the buildings, you can walk near the reactor, everything's fine. But if something goes wrong, it is catastrophic. So visiting there, walking there, I mean, what did you take away from that experience?
Well, one thing, back in Slavutich, there's this huge memorial to all of those poor firemen who died. And you see this memorial. And
so in the show, he's one of the heroes. He's one of the first characters you meet who's going up trying to put the fire out and knows, senses something's wrong, but doesn't understand what's happening.
Well, here's the good news. You have, what was it, a minute and a half that you need to serve your country, and this is the minute and a half, and I need you to go out and throw the stuff over the side. Remember that part of the movie? Yeah. But you only have a minute and a half, and that one poor guy who tripped. I mean, anyway, just incredible, really, really, but wrenching to see this memorial in the 90s, which is when I was there. That was a tribute to all of those firemen who died. But what's interesting, the sarcophagus had to be built. And so all these people had to pour to put the fire out and all of that, and then build basically this entombment, because there was really, no cap if you will, for this reactor when it blew. That was the design. And that was another reason why we had to get that reactor 3 shut down, because it didn't have a containment dome. So anyway, to see this sarcophagus, and then, by the way, from doing some, because I, of course, this was years ago when I was there, I found out that it started to cave in, and the international community had to come in again and spend quite a bit of money building this kind of metal arch over it, which is new from when I was there back in the 90s. So it was actually failing itself. But it wasn't just the reactor. Just for a minute on the environmental, the exclusion zone was enormous. So it started off fairly small, and then all these people had to be evacuated from a much bigger area, I think 19 miles or something. But the contamination is just, phenomenal.
Ploughshares Fund doesn't take a position on nuclear power. We just deal with nuclear weapons, and that's a big enough challenge. But let me ask you, what do you think about nuclear power? What's your position?
Well, I happen to be a climate change gal, right? I really care about climate change, and so I've been kind of on the fence. I'm much more of a renewable gal. I think solar and wind, and I think they have. To me, they're much sounder. I wish we could solve the waste problem. I did spend years and years and years, over a decade, working on the waste issues, and we haven't figured it out yet. As far as how to handle it.
People don't understand this.
Well, it's the NIMBY thing. Not in my backyard. It's fine if we have nuclear power, maybe, but I don't want to deal with that waste. But what most people don't recognize is a huge amount of at least the low-level radioactive waste we have worldwide is from the medical industry. Not from nuclear power plants. So even
we'll
if
have another podcast on that, but just this. So some members of our board think nuclear power is a bargain with the devil. Other members think it's a necessary component to solve climate change. Right. So that's one of the reasons we don't take a position. Right. But most people don't realize there is no solution to the waste. This is like the sewer backing up, and we have 100 reactors in the United States alone, and their waste is still sitting there. We got no place to put it.
Yeah, pools.
And so if you have an accident at a coal plant, it's a problem. It's a disaster. But you have a accident at a nuclear power plant, and this is centuries of cleanup, and there is no real solution to this. The best you can do is contain it, and that's what you saw at Chernobyl.
Yes, in a nutshell. But if you're talking about radioactive waste messes around the world, a power plant is nothing compared to the Manhattan Project and the amount of wastes and messes we made in building nuclear weapons, which obviously is more to the heart of what you care about at Ploughshares and what I care about. And those messes are pretty darn severe.
If I can ask, having grown up near one of those sites.
This is your backyard.
Yeah, it was my backyard, and I'm sure my lifespan is shorter for it.
And tell people where.
At near the Hanford site in eastern Washington. And it held the plutonium reactor and is probably one of the most contaminated sites in the United States.
Yeah.
And so, Gretchen, I would love to hear, you made the comment, you did work on these cleanup issues for a while. How does one clean up a nuclear mess like that?
So first off, it isn't just nuclear. That's what makes it even trickier. Come on. So when all these cleaning things are used, carbon tetrachloride, really hazardous, nasty stuff, and guess what? That stuff doesn't have a half-life. It never goes away. So there's a 7 square mile plume underneath basically Hanford of carbon tetrachloride.
A plume?
A plume means basically an area that contains, it's all that carbon tetrachloride is underneath the site. Good news about Hanford is you've got a water table that's quite deep. Uh-huh. Now, if you want to go to Oak Ridge, for instance, your water table is, right under the surface almost. And there were places back in the creeks and things where just incredible amounts of mercury were found. Mason jars full of mercury. Again, no half-life for mercury. Mm. So in some ways, the hazardous stuff was as bad or worse than some of the nuclear, which is kind of interesting. But the old-fashioned way of handling this is muck, suck, and truck. And so what you do is you scoop up all of that yucky stuff of whatever it is that you're trying to, clean up. Even in Chernobyl, right? You're scraping off the layer of dirt and all the plant material and everything. And then you're sucking it out of, if it's a pond or whatever. And then you got to truck it somewhere. So I know it's kind of a silly term, but that's in fact what people think of when they think of the tried and true way of cleaning things up. And what I worked on for over a decade was innovative technologies to try to clean up some of this stuff, particularly the hazardous. And so we would use things like bioremediation, which are basically, think of little Pac-Man bugs that are going down and eating the contaminants, which is pretty cool.
Including eating the radioactive.
No, this is really eating the
Damn,
the
I thought we were going to get
hazardous.
some mutant bacteria.
No, Marvel Universe not coming to you anytime soon.
Okay, good.
Anyway, So there are innovative ways to try and handle some of this, but I ended up shifting careers because, frankly, a lot of the money went away from the cleanup projects and more focused on caring about the nonproliferation side of things.
I was just calculating how much we're spending on nuclear weapons and related projects in this year's budget, and I came up with $75 billion is how much we're spending this year, and $5.8 billion of that is cleanup. And half of it's going to Hanford, half of it's going to Savannah River. So we're still cleaning this up.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's forever. So there's something called, there's the tanks, right? So we have the single shell tanks and the double shell tanks, which is where a lot of the sludgy stuff that's left over, that's where it's being held. And anyway, there are a lot of people that have been working on the tank project forever. I personally was a Vado zone, which means basically the area between the surface of the land and where the water table starts. That was my focus when I was working on this for a decade, which, people back then, imagine this, Joe. So you've got this operation, you're trying to clean things up, and people used to use carbon tet to clean typewriters. So you take this pipe, it has holes in it, you send it out of the building, and you just let this stuff just flow into basically the ground.
Oh.
This is how they disposed of it.
Well,
because they're in a hurry, got it out of the building, and who cares? It's a big desert, right? Who cares where this goes and what it does? And here we are, umpteen million years later, trying to clean it up.
So after we've mucked, sucked, and trucked all this nuclear waste, and we put it in these tanks, what's the plan? Is it just going to sit there? What is Hanford like today, and how is that impacting the greater, what do you call it, SeaTac? Seattle-Tacoma area?
Yes. The honest answer is I'm not working on it anymore, so to give you the exact figures or anything, I can't.
Yeah, it's okay.
But I can tell you that one of the technologies we were looking at is vitrification. So that's basically putting electrodes into these areas, and this was really more where the ground was just like super mucked up and trying to basically turn it into glass. And then there's also...
Yes, they wanted to use that kind of technique in Fukushima to harden the ground there to contain the plume
and
that's
I've seen,
been extending from that nuclear
you do know
disaster.
what a plume is. Look at you.
Yes, I do.
But the other thing with the back to the tanks for a minute was glass logs. And so a similar kind of technology to try to turn this into glass logs so that it basically can't leach out. And one that's really kind of interesting, if I can throw in another little tidbit, is one thing I worked on when I was a graduate student was what to do with decommissioned nuclear submarines. And this is right up your alley. And so my job was to look at the draft environmental impact statement that the Navy put out dealing with the Polaris subs. And the two options out there was, one, cut the pressure vessel up, scuttle them at sea. And the second option was to drag it up the Columbia River with the pressure vessel out, which is where most of the contamination is, and just basically park it in this huge area that looks like the size of a football field at Hanford. And that's what ended up winning out as the option. But anyway, just another interesting thing that Hanford gets used for.
You've got us going on this. We're going to have to bring on people from Hanford Challenge, which the group of environmentalists up there have been dedicated to trying to clean up this mess and highlighting
But remember, it isn't just Hanford. There are all of these other weapon sites around the country where this was done. And some of them, I'm telling you, Oak Ridge, probably in worst case. Savannah River. Anyway, there's a lot of messes around. We shouldn't just pick on Hanford.
No, it's just the one that's in our backyard here.
Exactly.
We have friends and family.
I have deep connections.
So we'll start with that one, okay?
That's fine.
We'll start with that one. Can we just talk to you a little bit about your job as director of Pacific Northwest Nuclear Laboratories Center for Global Security? What does that mean? How did nuclear fit into that sense of
So I ended up,
global
as I
security?
said, I shifted over career-wise and got into nuclear nonproliferation, and it's been actually really exciting and really fun because it's really an international, that's the global term. So there's a lot of work we've done with global partners. Again, this is out of PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab. Bottom line is there's just so many projects that you can, so many different angles you can look at. But where I've really had fun because of my environmental background is looking at the connection between climate change and global security. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I was fortunate enough to meet an admiral here or there and learn that their biggest concern is having the runways basically going underwater because of sea level coming up. And if they can't protect their assets in the Pacific because of sea level rise, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And then you've got Hampton Roads in Virginia, where all these service people work. I mean, you've got the Navy, the Air Force. I mean, everybody's there. And if they're living and the sea level's coming up, which it is, and they can't get to their base, they can't get to where they need to in the time of a crisis, that's an enormous issue. The Arctic is opening up. And so now there's all these tensions with Russia. And, all those waterways are opened up and who controls what and, what happens. These are really interesting problems that I think.
Interesting. That's one way to put it.
Scary, very scary problems. And the last one I'll give you, and this is probably the one that keeps me up the most at night, is you have the country of Pakistan. And guess what? They have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And you have sea level rise, and you've got a mega city, which is over 10 million people, Karachi, it's 21 million. And all of a sudden, sea level comes up, and what happens, it intrudes, and it ends up covering up the ground where they're growing crops and where the people of lesser means, mostly men, displaced, live. So you don't have any food, you don't have a job, sea level's coming up, and the country's kind of in a mess, and they have nuclear weapons. You want to talk about the perfect scenario. In fact, Joe, I recommend that when you go to Hollywood, you give them this scenario, and this is what there should be a series made out of. Huh. It is it is a really scary scenario.
You mean climate change meets nuclear instability? In
that part of the world, exactly. And bad things happen. And people feel unrest, they feel there's conflict occurs, and war could break out. I think it's a very plausible scenario.
So, Gretchen, you've mentioned this now a couple of times, that you started out as a climate change and environmental science person. How did you go from being a scientist out on a boat, as far as I understand, in the Atlantic to the halls of Washington?
Oh, I was in the Pacific.
Oh, Pacific.
Between Hawaii and Tahiti. Not a bad place to be. But I was an oceanographer assistant, basically a grunt on a research vessel. And it wasn't real enough. How does internal wave motion really help mankind? I couldn't get it. So I naively said, I want to go back and do the people side of science. I didn't know what public policy was or meant. So off I went to grad school and got a degree in it. And that's when I got into submarines of all crazy things, because frankly, it was paying me to go. And then I ended up in D.C. And in D.C., I've landed at OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment, which doesn't exist anymore, but frankly is being looked at again right now, actually, to possibly be refunded. But to me, where science and technology and public policy come together is the most exciting place to be, because that's where decisions get made. And if it's just the science and tech, it's kind of boring, like internal wave motion. No offense, people who are oceanographers, and that's what they do. And if it's just, the straight up policy stuff without the science and technology bent, for me personally, it's not as exciting. But where the two come together, that's where I have a really good time.
Can I get wonky here for a second? When did you work for OTA?
84 to 90.
Okay, so I was on the Hill, the Armed Services Committee staff and GovOps then, and we depended on OTA for all kinds of technical assessment, including their landmark study on ballistic missile defense, which is what got them in trouble. So what happens is the Republicans hated that study because it disproved the basic selling point of Ronald Reagan's ballistic missile defense program. So when Newt Gingrich seizes control,
exactly,
the first thing he does is kill OTA, kills the independent scientific assessment that Congress had been depending on for decades. This is, it's like a lobotomy. Gingrich gives the Congress a lobotomy. He cuts out all kinds of things like the Arms Control Caucus that was there. He cuts the staff sizes on the committee. He basically makes it more difficult for Congress people to do their job because they didn't want competition for the executive branch. So what do you mean that they want to bring it back? I've been wondering about this. Why doesn't Nancy Pelosi bring this back?
The Congress is looking into hearings about this, and it's going to be really important to see whether or not it has a chance to make it. But if, in fact, the money can come back in to reunite and ignite OTA, it'd be fantastic. And it might come in to GAO, but it could actually be OTA all over again.
Well, if the Democrats retain control of the House, I mean, they should definitely restore the scientific advice that they've been denied for decades now. Good. I hope they do that. Before we end,
I get the last question, right?
Yes, you do.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Gretchen is a dear friend and someone I consider a mentor. And just with your history, which we just, heard a little bit about, you have walked in so many different areas and had so many different experiences. When you look at the young people coming up in the field, especially young women, what advice do you have for them? You've always given me just really incredible advice.
Well, one is definitely when it comes to choosing where you want to work, find some topic that you're super passionate about and find a mentor who's going to be looking out for you. Because if the job looks great, but there's no mentorship, I can't tell you how many people I've seen where it's just gone wonky and hasn't worked. So I think that's really, really important. And I particularly, as you can tell, think that this intersection of science, technology, and public policy is a super exciting place to be. There's so many problems that need to get worked on. And so pick one that really speaks to you and find a mentor who's going to really help you and go make this a better planet. I mean, that's what this is all about. And that's why I'm passionate to be on the board of Ploughshares. And because the work is just fantastic and it's where people need to be. And now that I'm retired, I can do this and it's exciting to be part of it. So thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Gretchen. Michelle, I'm glad you got the last question. That was a good one.
Thank you.
Gretchen, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us and talk, and thank you for your service on the board. We greatly value you and your technical expertise and your political sensibilities. It's a pleasure working with you.
Oh, same. Thank you.
Letters. We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Today's question comes from our listener, Natasha, who's in Vermont. And Natasha asks, I know it's a hypothetical, but wouldn't nuclear weapons be useful if aliens invade? Should we keep a handful around in case that happens?
That is a great question, and it raises sort of three issues for me. One, this idea that we need nuclear weapons to defend against an alien invasion is one that's encouraged by Hollywood. This is often how we see nuclear weapons depicted in the films, that they are our ultimate weapon, our ultimate security. So you see Will Smith in one of the great scenes of cinematic history in Independence Day flying a nuclear bomb into the belly of the invading ship and destroying the entire alien invasion. Or you see Bruce Willis in Armageddon taking nuclear weapons up to an asteroid to blow it up before it can hit the Earth. Or you see the troops and giant robots going down to the bottom of the Pacific and Pacific Rim to take a nuclear weapon through the interdimensional portal to blow up these colossal monsters that are invading the Earth. So nuclear weapons save the day. I don't think that's how Hollywood should be depicting this. These weapons are our greatest threat, not our national security. One of the first uses of nuclear weapons in films kind of showed that, whether you go back to Them, where we had giant ants growing out of the Nevada desert that were mutated by nuclear explosions, or you had Godzilla, who was awakened, remember, by nuclear testing in the Pacific and was coming to sort of avenge nature against a human society gone mad. That's the way I wish Hollywood would depict nuclear weapons. They're the problem, not the answer. But let's go to your question. Suppose we succeeded in getting rid of all nuclear weapons. Shouldn't we keep a couple around in case of interstellar invasion? I would say, one, just because you have eliminated nuclear weapons doesn't mean you can't bring them back. And this is a common answer to the bomb in the basement problem. What if you get rid of all of your weapons and suddenly somebody comes up and says, I have one, and unless you do what I say, I'm going to use it against your country? Well, one of the answers to that is that you can reinvent nuclear weapons. You can't kill the knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons. And frankly, there's a lot of the material, even after we got rid of all our nuclear weapons, a lot of the material would still be around, presumably in internationally safeguarded stores, for example, for plutonium. But you could still get that and quickly construct a nuclear weapon to deal with your flying saucers. Two, one of the ways to deal with this is to recognize that if we are invaded by an alien force, it's highly likely that they will have surpassed nuclear weapons in their technology, and our bombs won't be any use to them. There's something called the Fermi paradox, which comes from Enrico Fermi, answering, well, if we asking the question, if we have all these stars and all these stars have planets, and there's billions and billions of them, and there's presumably intelligent life, how come we haven't been visited so far? That's the Fermi paradox, they call it. Why haven't we been visited by alien life? And one of the proposed solutions to that paradox is that when civilizations get to the point where they invent atomic weapons, they destroy themselves. And so they don't get to the point of having interstellar travel because they've killed themselves off. Presumably, any planet that has solved that problem and has gotten to interstellar travel will have found a way probably either to neutralize nuclear weapons or have developed weapons so far beyond nuclear weapons that ours would be as puny to them as, using a shotgun against a tank. And three, and this may be the real answer to your question, you could always keep a few nuclear weapons in reserve if you thought you might need them for asteroids or comets or aliens. You could put a few under international control. In fact, this was what Harry Truman wanted to do. The very first resolution presented to the United Nations was to establish an atomic commission to deal with, among other things, eliminating nuclear weapons. Remember, the United States was the only one who had them at that time. And one of the answers was to take the U.S. nuclear weapons and give them to this new atomic commission, and the UN would control them. So that's a possible answer. Keep a few nuclear weapons under international control. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for asking it.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.